Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk. Today's topic is Dynamics 365 Project Operations, Deployment Options and Scenarios. My name is David, and I'll be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this session through Teams live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. This session is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. When you join this event, your name, email address, and/or phone number may be viewable by other session participants in the attendee list. By joining, you're agreeing to this experience. The recording will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenters or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions throughout the broadcast and during the Q&A section near the end. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Satish Panwar, Senior Program Manager, and Martin Walker, Senior R&D Solutions Architect. Satish, over to you.
Thank you, David, for the introduction, and thank you very much to everyone in attendance today. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this Tech Talk and provide details on deployment options that are available within Dynamics 365 project operations. We will also be covering deployment scenarios that may be valid for your implementation. I also have Martin Walker here with me today, who will be co-presenting. Before we get started, I want to share with you our Dynamics 365 implementation guide, which contains a wealth of information gained from our collective experience across thousands of Dynamics implementations. Download it today from aka.ms/D365 implementation guide for detailed insight into how your implementations can incorporate success by design. With that, let's get right into the agenda. So today we will be covering quick overview of project operations. We will be covering different deployment types that are available within Dynamics 365 project operations, followed by deployment scenarios. And during deployment scenarios, we'll also be covering a brief architecture as well. And we will end it with the resources and the Q&A. So let's get started. First of all, let's go through a very high-level quick overview of project operations. Dynamics 365 Project Operations is an offering that includes end-to-end capabilities all the way from project sales to project financials. Microsoft Dynamics 365 Project Operations connects sales, resourcing, project management, and finance teams in a single application to win more deals, accelerate project delivery, and maximize profitability. Through the capabilities of Power Platform, there are several insights that project operations will surface for all the different personas that are involved, such as resource utilization and P&L information for your project business. These are the main capabilities that you can expect to see in project operations. With project operations, the business leaders will get business insights to increase visibility across all teams, data, and processes, plus AI capabilities for better and faster business decisions. Sales team is enabled to win more deals and accelerate the sales cycle with fast and accurate quotes. Resourcing is set up to optimize resource utilization by aligning the right people with the right skills to the right projects. Project managers can accelerate the project delivery with state-of-the-art built-in project management that uses familiar, easy-to-use Microsoft project capabilities. Team members can improve the productivity through collaboration and visibility with integration to Microsoft Teams and submit expenses from anywhere. And finance team last can simplify the project accounting with time and expense tracking, governance, project costing, budgeting, invoicing, revenue recognition, and visibility into key business health metrics. Project operations is powerful on its own, but can be extended by our customers and partners who require more capabilities from Dynamics 365. Project operations has several better together scenarios with our Dynamics 365 portfolio and other products in the Microsoft ecosystem. Now, let's look at how project operations leverage our Dynamics 365 portfolio. We have out-of-the-box integration with Dynamics 365 Sales that allows our customers to manage their products and service opportunities and pipeline in a single view. With Dynamics 365 Finance integration, we are able to provide the Service Center, which is the ERP to our customers, extending project operations end-to-end capabilities all the way to account payable, account receivable, and general ledger. With marketing, we are providing capabilities that provide a comprehensive lead to opportunity to quote process for both products as well as service sales. And for customers who have both field service functions as well as project-centric service functions, we are able to support the central resource pool where resource availability can be managed regardless whether the resource is assigned to the projects or whether they are assigned to work orders in the field. Human resources based scenarios allow us to store consultant skills, profiles, leave and absence information, and master those in our HR system and pull these into project operations. With Dynamics 365 supply chain management, it allows us to support stocked and production-based scenarios for customers, especially in the manufacturing and engineering space. Project operations is built on top of Power Platform that provide us the power to use Power Automate, Power Apps, and Power BI, and be able to extend project operations capabilities depending upon customer needs. Project operations leverages capabilities directly from Project for the Web. Integration with Microsoft Teams is supported, where Teams can be leveraged for members of a project or the opportunity to collaborate and share documentation. And last, our partners. Project operations is a horizontal workload where we leverage the industry expertise of our extensive partner ecosystem to go the last mile to serve customers in a specific industry. Next, let's look at different deployment types that are available within Dynamics 365 project operations. To recap very briefly, we have three different deployment types for project operations: Lite deployment, resource or non-stock deployment, and stocked or production order scenarios. Boiling it down, a major design decision in any implementation project is to choose between a CE only, PMA only, or integrated deployment type. You will also sometimes hear other terminology used, so we are providing this for reference. The existing functionality that our customers are using within Dynamics 365 Finance for managing their projects, that functionality is now covered under the project operations umbrella as well. Formerly, it was known as PMA, or the project management and accounting module. The breadth of all the capabilities of applications built on Dataverse CE and project management and account in Dynamics 365 Finance and FNO goes under the overall project operations umbrella. Project operations is available as a license queue with all the capabilities included. Project operations has three deployment types. So the first deployment is Lite deployment resource-based scenarios. So if customer is looking only for the front-end capabilities, starting from sales to perform an invoice and not looking for finance capabilities, they can use the project operations on Dataverse environment and integrate with their third-party ERP. The second deployment type is resource or non-stock based scenarios. So if customer is a resource based and is a servicing organization looking to implement resource scheduling, tracking time and expense, that scenario is the combination of front end of CE application and finance capabilities of finance and operations. Middle line, 4 boxes are in CE, and with dual write, the information flows to FNO, and you can use FNO for the other blue boxes to track the expense, invoicing, revenue recognition, and project accounting. One major decision in resource or non-stock based scenario is where do you want to track expenses? So if you want to track expenses, light expenses, you can do that on the CE side, but if you want the full expense management capabilities, then you have that option to utilize the full expense management capabilities within Dynamics 365 Finance. Last deployment type is stocked production order scenarios, where we leverage the classic PMA capabilities from FNO. Our customers can continue to use these capabilities mostly for inventory based scenarios. If you are working with your prospect or customer looking to implement Dynamics 365, if the customer is inventory heavy or manufacturing companies where integration with stock and items is important, at this point of time, we recommend to implement classic PMA capabilities of FNO that are represented by the bottom line. To help our customers decide the deployment type, which is suited best for their implementation, we have also provided a deployment questionnaire. It is a series of questions to determine the right deployment type. At the conclusion of the questionnaire, a recommendation is provided to which deployment type is preferred based on the answers to your questions in the questionnaire. Project operations supports stock production order scenarios and non-stock resource-based scenarios on the same environment through legal entity level configuration. For example, Contoso can use the stocked production order capabilities in their US manufacturing facility. And another Contoso legal entity, Contoso Robotics, for example, can use the non-stock or resource-based capabilities in their legal entity. We have also provided here a link that you can utilize to access the questionnaire. Next, let's look at quick demonstration on how this questionnaire works. So on the left hand side, you have a couple of important topics that you need to provide answers for, and based on the answers, it would provide the recommendation. So it starts with deal management. Are you looking to manage opportunities as they move through the process before they become the project contracts? So let's say in this specific example, we require those capabilities. The next question is related to the task and resource planning. Do you utilize bottom-up project planning, or do you require advanced or extensible resource management, or do you require universal resource scheduling? So if you are looking for those capabilities, then answer that. Then the question on time and expense. Do you require workflows for the approval of time and expense? And then question regarding the financials. Do you require the advanced expense management and project financials? Let's say we do. Then do we require the non-stock or the resource material support on the projects? Let's say we do. And then the question related to stock materials. And what that means here is, are we consuming the stocked items on the projects? So stocked materials can exist in your environment, but depending upon if you are consuming them on the projects or not, that's what will determine this choice. So in this case, let's say we do not have stocked materials. So based on all the questions that you have answered in the questionnaire, the system or the questionnaire is now suggesting us to plan the project operations for resource or non-stock scenario based deployment. And from here, we can do the setup. One thing that I also want to cover is if you are looking for more information on any given topic. So if you are looking at stock material support, here we have also provided the links that will take you directly to the documentation, which can provide more details about that specific question. Next, we will be covering project operations deployment scenarios, and Martin will be covering that for us today. Over to you, Martin.
All right, thank you, Satish. Let me just share my screen here. All right, now let's talk about various functional scenarios, what needs to be considered, and therefore what our high-level recommendations would be. But before we do that, to help us understand some of the considerations, let's first take a brief look at the high-level architecture of the deployment options. As you can see in our simplified diagram, the components making up your project operations solution will depend on the deployment type you select. In the Lite deployment type, you're using only the customer engagement app, which also wraps the project for the web engine for schedule management. And that's illustrated here in our picture in the left-hand section there, where you have our project execution app, the CE app, built on top of Dataverse. And we have project for the web. Its user interface is wrapped in the projects module of the customer engagement app. And then the projects for the web scheduling engine persists its data asynchronously into Dataverse. In the stocked or production-based deployment type, you are using only the finance and operations app. And you can see that on the right-hand side of the diagram, where we have our F&O app, which includes, amongst other things, the revenue recognition invoicing and sophisticated expense functionality. Finally, in the resource or the non-stocked deployment type, you are both using both the customer engagement and the finance and operations apps, and they are integrated for you via dual write, which is why we sometimes also refer to this as the integrated deployment type. Usually a particular persona will either be working with one app or the other app. So the people using the front end capabilities for project execution will usually be living in that customer engagement app, and the project accountants app, project accountants in the resource or non-stock scenario will be using the project management and accounting module in the finance and operations app. Obviously, it's possible that some users may access both. And if you're using advanced expenses, then those users would be using a small portion of the finance and operations app to enter expenses. All right. Now that we understand the architecture, let's start with a central scenario that we've already touched on. If you use the deployment wizard, you are now aware that a requirement for stocked materials on projects directs you to the stocked or production order deployment type. And the names we've given those deployment types explain why quite clearly. The stocked product consumption or project production orders are only supported via the standalone finance and operations project management and accounting module today, not the integrated or the customer engagement only deployment types. So looking at our considerations, if we consume stock products on any projects in a particular legal entity, we can't have the integration with the customer engagement app switched on. One nuance that Satish already mentioned is that this can be configured per company. In other words, some legal entities could still be integrated if they don't need stocked product consumption. If they do need stock product consumption, then that integration would be switched off and you would in effect be using that stocked deployment type. So for that particular legal entity, only finance and operations, both for project execution and for project accounting. If a legal entity has the integration switched off, then clearly you can't use the customer engagement-based project execution front end for it, but instead would use the project execution functionality that is available in the F&O PMA module when the integration is turned off. Depending on your situation, it might be possible for you to avoid this current constraint by continuing to use another solution or manual process to track your stocked inventory with temporary integrations to project operations to capture consumption costs on your projects. Then you could adopt the standard stocked product functionality once available and retire the legacy solutions. If that is not reasonable for your implementation scenario, then you would choose the stock deployment type, assuming that's what you do. Then an additional bit of guidance would be to minimize the effort you expend on extensions built on top of the PMA project execution functionality, since you would likely need to redo such extensions if you migrate to an integrated deployment type later, once it has the stock product support you need, of course. There are also some more nuanced considerations around PMA features, which we will discuss next. What if you have dependency on PMA only features? So understand that of the various features provided by the standalone Finance and Operations PMA module, or classic PMA, not all of these are yet available in the integrated deployment mode, and we've listed some of them here. Sometimes this is just because the work hasn't been done yet, and sometimes this is because these features really now belong on the project execution side of the solution. So you do need to understand what is switched off in the integrated mode, and again, that's per legal entity, and that this will continue to evolve. If you need some of these features today for your implementation project, then it may be possible to close that gap for yourself by extension. But if the cost and complexity of doing that is too high, and you really do need to define what that means for your project, then that suggests you would need to implement the stocked deployment type. You should also consider that the design of any extensions must be holistic for the solution. In other words, assuming we're talking about the resource or non-stock deployment type, this is usually not just a matter of re-enabling project management and accounting features. Those are controlled by a class, a feature class, which checks to see if the integration is switched on. If it is switched on, then it follows one code path, and if it isn't switched on, then it follows a different code path. And similarly, some of the metadata elements, UI elements, and controls, and so on, again, would be tagged with that feature class, such that they wouldn't appear if you're in integrated mode, but would if you're not in integrated mode. So that's kind of how that works. But either way, you do need to consider that those designs need to be holistic for your solution. So it's not usually just re-enabling PMA features. You would often end up needing some extensions to F&O to switch the feature back on, and then to the Customer Engagement Project Operations app, so that you had a consistent view of your project actuals on both platforms. And then also some dual right map customization to link them properly. So this may be possible for your particular scenario, but let's be clear that this is probably not a practical proposition for any reasonable level of cost and time for any implementation project to add full stocked product support by extension. First of all, this effort would kind of be a throwaway, replaced by the standard capability that we're already busy developing. That said, it might be possible for a really narrow scenario. In any event, you should consider the total cost of ownership of such an approach very carefully. Similarly, while it might be technically possible to do something like that, it would be a very big and very risky lift to implement Project Operations Lite and the Finance and Operations Project Management and Accounting module separately, and then try and build your own custom integration between them. This, when you think about it, would amount to repeating much of the work we've already done over the course of more than 2 years, with most or all of the same design challenges, but unfortunately without the ability to modify the base code and metadata as we are able to. Instead, everything would have to be done via extensions, which would add considerable additional complexity. So not technically impossible to do that, but generally not a path we would recommend to build your own integration or build your own stock product support. Let's talk about ISV add-ons or your own extensions built on top of the project management and accounting module. This is obviously closely related to what we just talked about, but whether it's an ISV module or a custom extension that you built for yourself, your first question should be, do we still need this? It may be that you don't anymore. It might have been legacy functionality that has since been replaced by what is available in the integrated solution, or that your business processes have changed and it doesn't make sense anymore. However, assume for the moment that you do still need that particular bit of functionality, then you should also think about where this functionality belongs. Is it about project execution or project accounting? It may be that whatever it was built on top of project management and accounting really now belongs on top of the customer engagement project operations app because it's more closely related to project execution than financial backend processing. If it does still belong on the project management and accounting module, then clearly you need to make sure that this feature, the feature it builds on, is enabled in the integrated mode. Or if it belongs on customer engagement, then you would need to know when refactoring it into a Power Platform customization, potentially also with some dual write bits and some F&O extensions, would be available to you. Obviously, that's more in your own control if it's your own extension. If it's an ISV solution, then you really need to talk to your ISV about it. Your implementation project may or may not be able to accommodate the timeline when it's available with reasonable risk by time phasing your project accordingly. In other words, if you can live without that functionality for a while and wait for it to become a standard part of your ISV solution as they refactor to support integrated project operations, then that's great. But you do need to talk to your ISV and understand what they're truly committed to there, with a reasonable buffer. You plan very conservatively if you need to take a dependency on anything in a roadmap, and that would be whether it's our roadmap or an ISV's roadmap. There may also be alternative ISV solutions that better fit the integrated scenario and your timelines. So bear that in mind. At the end of the day, if you're strongly dependent on an ISV add-on and you can't wait for it to support the integrated deployment, then you really would need to implement the stocked deployment type instead. Hence our recommendation. Let's talk about upgrading from AX 2012. The first question is whether you utilize stocked product consumption on your projects or only non-stocked or resource product consumption in your projects in AX 2012. If you need stock product support on your projects, then clearly you need to use the stock deployment type anyway, as we have just discussed at some length. And your normal criteria would then apply in deciding whether to upgrade in place or re-implement and migrate data. And by that I mean, depending on how long you've had your AX 2012 system and the state of the data in it and what your customizations look like, and whether you're looking for a fresh start, you might decide that even though you can do an in-place upgrade, that it's better to implement fresh and then migrate configuration and master data and so on. That's what I mean by that, by your normal criteria. Bear in mind, though, that the in-place data upgrade of AX 2012 PMA data takes you to the PMA only deployment type in Dynamics 365. In other words, it's upgrading the projects you had in AX 2012, and they're now projects that are set up in the project management and accounting module in finance and operations. Even if you only consume non-stocked products or resources on those projects, the in-place AX 2012 upgrade can't take you to the integrated mode. And part of the reason for that is that the standard system will not let you switch a legal entity to integrated mode if it already has projects. Of course, you can take a path from AX 2012 projects to an integrated solution, assuming you don't have stock product consumption, at least until that is available. You can get to that integrated deployment mode by configuring a new deployment of project operations for the resource and on-stock-based scenarios, and then migrating your data into it. So clearly, the first bit of guidance is determine the deployment type you need based on your requirements, but then also consider whether that constrains whether you can do an in-place upgrade or whether you really need to implement a fresh linked pair of environments and migrate into it. I'm not really going to talk about the third option is, would you be migrating from AX 2012 using projects to project operations Lite? Probably not, because presumably you're using AX 2012 for the financials as well. And clearly the project operations CE app does not have that functionality. Okay, let's talk through another question that comes up quite a lot. What about if you want to add project operations to an existing Dataverse organization or instance with other existing customer engagement apps like sales or marketing? So obviously one consideration is which project operations deployment option have you selected for your implementation. And then for existing Dynamics 365 customer engagement, sales and marketing and customer service apps, bear in mind that, as would be the case for any implementation of dual write, you would, if you're going to be going to integrated mode, then you are setting up dual write, so you need to do some bootstrapping of your existing data. And the reason for that is, finance and operations stripes data by the company or legal entity. And that concept traditionally doesn't really exist in the customer engagement or Dataverse world. But obviously, if you're integrating them via dual write, then you need to add that information. And that's what we mean by data bootstrapping. We've got a link below on the docs article on what that dual, how to go about that dual write bootstrapping. So that's probably going to be required. And you may also need some other updates that you need to consider. So for example, project operations integrated expects that accounts are of type customer so that they can be synchronized over to customers in finance and operations for project accounting. Another consideration is that if one of those existing customer engagement apps is PSA, then that either needs to be upgraded to project operations Lite, and we're going to talk more about that in a moment, or it needs to be removed if you're talking about a Lite or a non-stocked implementation. Another thing to bear in mind, and this obviously is not really specific to this scenario, but bear in mind that you're changing how your business is going to work as a result of doing this. So business processes need to be thought about again. Your business processes may vary by app. So say, for example, you're using field service today and now you're adding project operations. Well, field service, for example, has some procurement capabilities, whereas project operations is relying on the supply chain management functionality in finance and operations for any procurement. Also, obviously, as we've already pointed out, project operations for the resource and non-stock deployment type uses standard dual write maps to integrate Dynamics 365 Finance and the Dynamics 365 customer engagement apps. Bear in mind that dual write, as documented, is not compatible with data integrator. In other words, the CDS data integrator prospect to cash solution. So while technically you could still be using some CDS DI with some custom maps, you couldn't be using the out-of-the-box prospect to cash solution, or for example, the field service integration solution, which builds on top of the prospect to cash solution, because you need to remove that in order for it to be compatible with dual write. So bear that in mind. So our recommendations then generally would be, one other comment about this CDSDI. Sometimes it can be difficult to remove. That can be complicated by dependencies that you may have taken on top of that solution. There is actually a dormant version that was posted on Yammer of the Prospect to Cash CDSDI solution. I don't believe it's an app source, but it was released in Yammer. And essentially what that's doing is it's allowing you to leave it in place so you don't have to untangle all the dependencies, but not actually use it. And all the plugins are switched off and stuff like that, so it has no effect. Obviously better if you can to just remove it completely. If you can no longer use the Prospect Cache solution, best to get rid of it. Anyway, the general recommendation is reevaluate your business process for your existing Dynamics 365 customer engagement apps. Don't just restrict your conversation around business process to project operations, because you may be having some impact on those other processes too. And secondly, for resource or non-stop deployments, take advantage of the standard dual write maps for the near real-time integration it provides between the finance and operations and the customer engagement, the Dataverse platforms. For non-real-time integration or bulk data updates, other appropriate integration technology may need to be considered. And you can see I've got a little double asterisk there, and I'm pointing that to the dual write live sync limits. So the reason there, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more with data composition, is that everything is wrapped in a transaction, and you've got to control the size of a single transaction that is going to flow through dual write and live sync mode. But we'll talk more about that in a moment. All right, what if you want to migrate from PSA to Project Operations Lite? So first of all, that is currently in preview, upgrading from PSA to Project Operations. But bear in mind that little emphasis there on Lite, and currently in preview as of December 21st, without a work breakdown structure associated with that. So it's somewhat limited today in its preview form. That is expected to be generally available in February, so this month. But that will still be without the ability to have a work breakdown structure associated with your PSA projects. With the work breakdown structure support, that is expected to be generally available in August of this year. So bear that in mind. Obviously, if you have a work breakdown structure, or you can't wait for GA, then the way you would do this, which is what we would have been doing last year, for example, is to preserve your PSA data, uninstall it, and then install Project Operations, and then migrate the data into it. Bear in mind also that there are a few minor feature differences between PSA and Project Operations, so take that into account, during your upgrade. As with anything like this, you may have some impact on your current business processes and extensions, so you need to consider that. Equally important and easy to forget is that you might require some changes to your integrations. So, for example, if you had a PSA integration which was manipulating schedule affecting tables directly in PSA, you can no longer do that, and there's a nuance to that, but you can no longer do that if you are using the project for the web for your scheduling, because it controls the schedule affecting tables and you cannot directly manipulate them in Dataverse. Because this is the project for the web scheduling engine that persists those changes asynchronously into Dataverse. So you can't just go after Dataverse directly. Instead, we have a scheduling API, and we've got a link to the documentation about it there. And you would instead need to use the scheduling API. So that would impact any existing integration you had with schedule affecting tables. Again, if you're doing an upgrade like this, obviously you've got some change management, some user training to do. Finally, another one, and we'll touch on this nuance about scheduling here as well, is that today Project for the Web currently supports a work breakdown structure up to 500 tasks. And then in addition to that, you can also have like a checklist associated with each task for things which are not really schedule affecting, but you simply want to be able to check off as done. And that can help keep you under that 500 limit. That 500 limit is being increased. But bear in mind that the scheduling compute load, we can't assume that the scheduling compute load is linear. So this is not suddenly going to increase by an order of magnitude, for example. I understand our next step on this is to support 1,000 tasks. If this is still not enough for you, then the bring your own scheduler feature, which is outlined in the roadmap that we just did the release notes for, the 2022 Wave 1 release notes that we just published a week or so ago. And I've got a link to them there. We are adding a feature to allow external planning. In other words, that means instead of using Project for the Web as your scheduling engine for project operations, the project operations customer engagement app, you would be using your own scheduler. And your own scheduler could either mean something entirely different, where there is an API published that you can use to update the schedule affecting information in Dataverse. Or it could mean, for example, using the project desktop application. Note that the current thinking, and this is supposed to be, this is projected to be generally available, as the release notes say, in August of this year. Note that the current thinking is that it'll be possible to choose the scheduler per project, and also that choice would then be fixed for the project once you've made it. So in other words, if your work breakdown structure starts out linked to the desktop client, then it would remain linked to the desktop client. Another one might be linked to Project for the Web, and a third one might be linked to a completely different scheduler, and those choices would persist. So bear all those in mind, and review the release notes for the time phasing of this ability to upgrade from PSA to Project Operations Lite. Upgrading from PSA to Project Operations Integrated really, is not something that's sort of supported as a standard feature, but we'll talk more about that kind of scenario when we're talking about different deployment types a little bit, and how you might migrate between them later. All right, what if your migrating customer has a dependency on PSA ISVs or customizations? This is much like the earlier scenario about dependency on PMA ISV functionality, so I'm not going to walk through it in detail. But many of the considerations are the same, thinking about when things get refactored and when that's going to happen, and can you time phase your project and so on. But one thing I want to call out again here, and this is somewhat similar to the upgrade scenario with scheduling, is that the Project for the Web scheduling engine is managing your work breakdown structure, all your schedule affecting items. So likely any such customizations or ISV modules that are directly manipulating the schedule affecting Dataverse tables would need some changes. In other words, they would have to start using the scheduling API, at least if Project for the Web is the scheduling engine. If Project for the Web is not the scheduling engine, once we're generally available with Bring Your Own Scheduler, then that obviously changes that situation a bit. But I do want to call that out, that in terms of what's available today, you would need to, anything schedule affecting would obviously undergo some substantial changes there. So again, our general recommendation was, implement your Lite or your resource or non-stock based deployment types as appropriate. If you're coming from, if you have a dependency on PSA ISV extensions, and you would need to refactor extensions or integrations relying on direct manipulation of those schedule affecting tables, unless all your projects will be planned externally. Now let's talk about another question which comes up regularly. This is, what if you've implemented with one deployment type and want to migrate to a different deployment type? So first, let's talk about Lite, moving from a Lite deployment type to a resource or non-stocked or integrated deployment type. First of all, it's important to realize that this is going to be a significant implementation effort. So for example, you're going to have some impact on your current business processes and extensions. So you need to take that into account. There are some schema differences on the customer engagement side between the Lite and the integrated deployments, not least of which, again, is that per company striping. It wouldn't be the case for a Lite deployment, but it would be the case for integrated. So again, you need to do some bootstrapping. There are no out-of-the-box migration scripts available to do this for you today, although it is a feasible thing to do, is to touch your data so that it's as you would expect it to look at an integrated deployment. If you're doing this, obviously you would need to be understand fairly deeply the mapping concepts between the customer engagement app and finance and operations, as we have, and I've linked to our documentation on that. Probably one of the trickiest parts of this would be working out what data would need to be synchronized between customer engagement and finance and operating, and then I mean existing data, in other words, closed or open projects, costs or unbilled sales that are already being posted, milestones, invoices, and so on. Obviously, you can't sort of go backwards on the customer engagement app and reprocess things that have already been processed. So you would need to come up with a bit of a data migration strategy for reflecting those already processed transactions in your balances, at least on the finance and operations side, so that you're then able to switch on the integration and start using it. There might be some license impact as well. So while the project operations SKU, the full license, and for the team member license for that matter, covers both platforms, your change in business process may mean that now some people are using functionality on the finance and operations app outside of what is covered by project operations, like say in the AR module or something like that. So you may, end up needing some attached licenses to cover that kind of scenario. For most users, though, certainly on the project execution side, people like project managers and so on, they would be covered by the project operations license, which would then, that license covers you for both platforms. So that aspect, but bear it in mind. Obviously, if you're migrating from a legacy financial system, in other words, you had Lite integrated with a legacy financial system, then obviously you have to redo that, and you also have to take into account reconciliation between that legacy system and finance during your cutover process. You also again have some required changes to your integrations, things that might have integrated with PSA before or project operations Lite before, or may now be integrating on the F&O side. And obviously, this is a significant process change, so you've got some change management and user training to be done there. So the best guidance of all, of course, is if you know you need to do this from the beginning, then if at all possible, implement the integrated deployment from the beginning and avoid this significant migration exercise later. Otherwise, develop a proper implementation plan for your new integrated environment, including all the usual aspects that you would see in our Success by Design guide around data migration, functional and performance testing, detailed cutover planning, reconciliation, hypercare, you name it. So, don't think of this as something that is just, a couple of clicks of a button and you have now switched to deployment type. Similarly, some might want to integrate from the stock deployment type to the integrated deployment type. By now, you probably realize that this is, going to be an even more complex proposition than even coming from Lite to integrated. Of course, there are the same implementation details that need to be figured out for any implementation project, like business process changes, licensing, testing, training, and so on. But the bottom line is that you would need to implement either a new finance and operations instance, or at least a new company in your existing instance, and then migrate your data to the appropriate targets, whether that's project execution information being migrated to the customer engagement side, to the Dataverse side, or to the new finance and operations target for your new solution, as you would, in migrating from any other legacy system. And that means with all the sort of complexities and limitations that usually implies. In other words, to manage complexity, we often decide in an implementation project to leave behind detailed transaction history because it's, technically possible to do, but very complex, and it's not really worth it. So you'll usually bring in, open transactions and balances and things like that. Maybe a few historical transactions here and there. We do intend to provide some tooling to help with data migration. in this kind of situation, whether you're coming from, an F&O PMA implementation, that was a stocked implementation, or you've implemented stocked and now you want to add some of the richness of the project execution functionality on the Dataverse, the customer engagement app. But do realize that tooling is not in the near-term roadmap yet, so that work's still to begin. And this is probably never going to be reduced to a few simple steps. Again, if you possibly can, if this is a fresh deployment and it's not, an existing PMA implementation, then clearly our recommendation would be again to implement the integrated deployment from the beginning and avoid this rather complex migration later. Let's talk very briefly about a couple of other things. Let's talk about, entry of time and expenses. Really, your major consideration here is what deployment type you've chosen. So if you've chosen the Lite deployment type, then you're using the customer engagement app for time entry. We do have a mobile experience as well, the universal client interface apps, and for example, something like Dynamics 365 for phone or a mobile browser. So we do have a mobile experience there. If you're integrated, then you're doing time entry on the customer engagement app, and timesheets in the finance and operations PMA module, project timesheets, is one of those things which is switched off in integrated mode. So you're doing your time entry in the customer engagement app. Again, the same mobile experience is available there. If you're the stocked deployment type, in other words, using PMA, then you're using the F&O app for timesheets, because in that case, that functionality is switched on as it always has been. And we do have the mobile app for, we do have the universal mobile app, where you publish mobile workspaces. I think long term, we expect that to be deprecated in terms of people building their own UI on top of the virtual entities which are now available, where you can expose entities as if they're part of customer engagement, then build a Power App on top of them. And there is a plan beyond the 2022 release wave 1. There was it was not in the April to September timeframe, but thereafter, to provide a more evolved mobile client than that sort of Dynamics 365 for phone or a mobile browser for time and expense entry for any of your project operations scenarios. Bottom line on this is, if you're using the customer engagement app for time entry, unless you're the stock deployment type. Similarly on expenses, so your first consideration here is what's your requirement for management control? In other words, do you need the fancy policy management and workflow and so on that's baked into the sophisticated expense management module in the finance and operations app? Obviously, if you do, then you're using expenses in the finance and operations app. If you don't really need those sophisticated capabilities, then you do actually have in the project operations CE app, you do actually have a basic expense entry capability, obviously without policy checking and all that kind of thing. So you would have the option in that case of, obviously if you're Lite, then you're going to be using basic expense entry on the CE app. If you're integrated, you have the choice of using either. Probably our recommendation would be keep it simple. If you're integrated, you're probably going to confuse your users if they're going to do a mixture of quick expenses and expense reports in F&O. So you probably want to choose one, even though technically you can use both at the same time. The mobile considerations are basically the same as before. You have your UCI apps. We are considering, in Dynamics for phone and so on, we are considering that work for a more evolved mobile time and expense entry. And then if stocked, you're using expense management in F&O, and again you've got the mobile workspaces, and the mobile workspace for expenses is actually quite nice. So that actually works reasonably well. Again, long term, perhaps that'll end up getting deprecated in favor of using Power Apps or the forthcoming mobile app. Final thing I want to touch on is not so much a business scenario, but let's talk about some customer-specific data composition. Most of these considerations really apply to any implementation. You should always consider anything unusual in your data composition which might impact the functionality or performance of your solution. There are just some additional nuances to bear in mind, particularly for the integrated deployment type, given its use of dual write. One example of such a nuance is that if you have quite a few legal entities, you may want to use the finance and operations cross-company data sharing feature. Obviously, this is presuming you're stocked or integrated. If you're stocked, no problem. If you're integrated, then you need to take this into account. You need to be aware that you can't have any tables which are part of a data sharing policy be a source for a dual write map, because data sharing is based on database triggers. So changes made by those database triggers will not be seen by dual write, which relies on changes flowing through normal finance and operations table methods to generate change events and then write them to the Dataverse target. Secondly, and this is the one I touched on briefly earlier, another is that fundamentally dual write is a synchronous integration pattern in its normal operating mode, where all the changes in a transaction need to be synchronized to the target side of the integration before the transaction can be committed on the source side either. This is why we publish guidance, and we have those dual write synchronization limits, both for initial and for live synchronization, linked there. But this is why we publish guidance on how long a synchronization to a target can take before it times out on the source side, and what that implies for the maximum number of lines in a business document. An example of this is how you should limit the number of lines on a pro forma invoice created in customer engagement, so that you're not trying to process thousands of lines in a single transaction. You should really only have, you should really, keep it to several hundred, not thousands of lines in a single invoice. Quite apart from the fact that it would take quite a while to process such a large invoice anyway. So for easy reference, we've linked those limitation documents, so do refer to them with your particular data composition in mind. And our recommendations then really apply to any implementation, though there are some project operations and deployment type specific details to consider. First of all, pay close attention to non-functional requirements in addition to your functional requirements, and then performance test your solution both thoroughly and early enough that you will be able to respond effectively to any surprises you uncover. I hope thinking through these scenarios has been helpful for you all, and with that, back to Satish to highlight some of our resources.
Thanks, Martin. Next, we'll look at some of the resources that we have put together that can help you understand more about project operations, delve more into the features and functionalities, and how to even get started. So a couple of links that we provided to the documentation where we are hosting the documentation for the all different deployments, as well as provided links for community, where you can get the latest and greatest that will be available on project operations from a roadmap perspective. If there are features or functionalities that are missing and is important to your customers, how do you go about submitting those ideas as well? And ultimately, the link to the Insider program as well. That can help you get into the Insider program, where our product group leverages, or shares the features and functionalities that will be upcoming in the product. We have today, as part of this tech talk, we have covered the basic deployment types and a very high level overview. But in future, we also plan on delivering new set of tech talks, and the next one probably is going to be focused on the project operations overview and how to plan your data migration in the integrated mode, as the data migration is a little different in the integrated mode as compared to any data migration that you would perform, whether that's only on the CE side or on the finance side. And then we are also going to be providing or coming up with a series of tech talks that will cover the functional topics related to project operations. Also, you should check out Microsoft Learn, where we have provided a lot of documentation with respect to different areas of project operations. And last, where do you find the latest information on licensing guide or support options and online services? With that, we have concluded our session. At this time, we still have a couple of minutes left, so if there are any questions, we can cover those as well.
Yeah, let me jump in here. There's one question which came up, which I think is a good one, and that is, Well, PMA still a good bet? Can you still deploy PMA and be confident that we're standing behind it? And the short answer to that is yes. I mean, PMA, in other words, the stock deployment type, is still a perfectly valid choice as a deployment type, and it will continue to be supported at least until we have feature parity with the integrated deployment type. In other words, covering all the things that you could do in PMA today. And and a reasonable path for migrating from your stock deployment type to that. So you shouldn't if you already have PMA, or if you have a requirement for the stock deployment for stock product consumption on your projects, then that is the choice you should make, and we will stand behind it.
Thanks, Martin. With that, David, back to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Satish. I've posted a link to a short survey in the Q&A panel. We'd like your feedback on today's session and hear what you'd like to see in future events. Thank you for your participation. As a reminder, the recording of today's session will be available on the TechTalk's Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenters and audience for joining us today.